then you got cancer.
Diversity.
Okay, there are all sorts of interesting diseases out there, and lots of them are quite exotic. You've got elephant man syndrome, and you've got progeria, which is a disease where you basically die of old age when you're about 10 years old, and then you got cannibals eating brains and getting prion diseases, and those are very exciting, and they're great and great, junior high school papers about disease and such. Oh, no, okay, come up to the front. Um, see, a couple more seats.
There's a fan back there that's
okay. So there are all sorts of these great made-for-TV movie diseases out there. But when you want to come to, say, basic meat and potatoes of human medical misery, there is nothing out there like depression. Depression is absolutely crippling. Depression is incredibly pervasive and thus important to talk about. I'll make the argument here today, a number of things, but one critical thing being that basically depression is like the worst disease you can get. And I'll make the argument for that in a bit. It is devastating. It is wildly common. Current estimates are 15% of us in this room will have a major depression at some point or other in our lives. So that is not good. What is also clear is it is worldwide. Currently, World Health Organization says depression is the #4 cause of disability on this planet. And by the year 2025, it's going to be #2 after obesity, diabetes-related disorders. So it is bad news, and it is becoming more common. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today are seemingly two very, very different topics and tie them together at the end. And what the main point is if you live inside only one of those topics, you're not going to understand this disease at all. First topic being, what does biology have to do with depression? Second topic being, what does psychology have to do with it? Okay, so starting off, first giving a sense of symptoms. And right off the bat, we've got a semantic problem, which is we all use the word depression in an everyday sense. You get some bad news about something, you know, to replace the transmission in your car, somebody disappoints you enormously, and you feel bummed, you feel depressed, you were down for a few days. That's not the version of depression I'll be talking about. Next version, you do have some sort of large, legitimate loss, setback, whatever, losing a job, unemployment, death of a loved one, and you are extremely impaired by a sense of malaise for weeks afterward. And then you come out the other end. That's sort of what I'll be talking about. But even more so what I'll focus on is the subset of individuals who, when something like that occurs, falls into this depressive state, and weeks and months later, they still have not come out the other end. Terminology, the everyday depression that we all have now and then, that sort of version. The second one, the something awful happens and you feel terrible for a while and then come out the other end, a reactive depression. The third version, where you are flattened by it for long periods afterward, a major depression. And what you also see with people with major depression after a while is it doesn't take something awful externally to trigger one of those again. Okay, so what are the symptoms about? If I had to define major depression in one sentence, I would say it's a biochemical disorder with a genetic component and early experience influences where somebody can't appreciate sunsets. And that's what this disease is about. And when you think about it, that is a very sad thing. You look at some of our major diseases, somebody with cancer, somebody crippled by heart disease, and you see the most unlikely things out there. You see somebody saying, well, obviously I'm not glad I'm dying of cancer, but without this disease, I never would have realized the importance of friends. I never would have reconciled with my family members. I never would have found my God on a completely weird level. I'm almost glad this has happened to me. Humans have this astonishing capacity to derive pleasure out of the most unlikely domains. What could possibly be worse than a disease whose defining symptom is the inability to feel pleasure? Thus, at the top of the list, anhedonia. Hedonism, the pursuit of pleasure, anhedonia, the inability to feel pleasure, that is what a depression is about. And you get someone who has just had some enormous good luck, a long-sought relationship, works out well, whatever, and they feel nothing. An inability to feel pleasure, way at the top of the list. What else? Grief, guilt, and that's where we got the semantic problem again, which is the everyday sort of depression. Something happens, bumps us out, and by definition, we are feeling some version of grief. Often we start obsessing at that point over some miserable thing we did to somebody 12 years ago and sort of despair in that. When you're talking about major depression, the grief and the guilt can be so severe that it actually takes on a delusional quality. Okay, not delusional in the sense of the schizophrenic with delusions, hearing voices, thought disorder, but a certain style with extreme depression. Let me give you an example. You have late middle-aged guy, perfectly healthy, and suddenly out of nowhere, he has a major heart attack. He's lying there in the hospital, and the reality is he's going to recover. He's going to have to make some changes in his lifestyle, but he's going to recover. He instead falls into a major depression. This has transformed his sense of who he is. Suddenly he's an old man. Suddenly there's all these things he can't do. He falls into a major depression. Yet he's recovering. Every day his family is in there saying, look, you're just depressed. You're getting stronger. The doctors are saying you're getting stronger. You're just depressed. It happens the hospital is circular. It has a corridor that forms a circle in it. And one day the family is in there saying, you're getting stronger. Look, the nurses said yesterday you did 1 loop around the hospital, and today you did 2 loops. You're getting better. You're getting stronger. And the person says, no, you don't understand. They're doing some construction. Last night, they closed down the outer corridor and they opened up a new little one so that 2 versions of this one, 2 loops there, shorter than the large one. I'm getting weaker, I'm going to die. This is like someone expecting to believe that last night they were like beavers digging through the walls there, making this new. This was the father of an acquaintance of mine, a structural engineer. This is what a structural engineer looks like when they're delusional to the point of saying that this is a world in which everything is inevitably getting worse. Depression built around that. Next, of course, one of the most dramatic and one of the most awful symptoms of depression, self-injury. Depression depressives mutilating themselves at a high rate, and of course, most notoriously, suicide, risks of suicide, and that is absolutely tragic in teenagers, early adults. That, along with accidents, is the leading cause of death. Major bad news. Another set of symptoms that wind up being important, something called psychomotor retardation. Everything is exhausting. It's exhausting to do stuff. It's exhausting to think stuff. You were there and you can't do the laundry because where's the basket, and you got to find change for the machine, and you got to go get detergent, and just it's too much. Everything is too much, and you fall into this paralyzed state. Something very interesting in that regard. You get someone who is severely depressed, like to the point of hospitalization, and when they are absolutely crippled with psychomotor retardation, that's not when you worry about suicide. This is someone who's having enough trouble getting out of bed and getting dressed each day. They're not going to figure out how to shred the hospital mattress and make a noose out of it. Where you've got your problems is when somebody begins to get better from a severe depression, when they're starting to come out. That's where the psychomotor retardation relieves enough that suddenly they've got the energy to do something catastrophic. That's when people are on suicide watches, when you have clinicians who are oriented well. Next, something really interesting. And in lots of ways, the single point I want to hammer in here over and over and over is something that people with depression constantly battle with. Back to semantics. We all get depressed. Bad stuff happens to us. We all get depressed. We feel lousy. We feel withdrawn. We feel sort of a sense of grief, and we're not taking much pleasure, and we withdraw. And then we get better. We cope. We heal. We deal with things in life. What's the deal with you that you can't do that? And there's this lurking sense, given that all of us have periods of being depressed and come out the other end, when you look at people who instead go down and stay down there to this crippling extent, there's always this little voice between the lines there of, come on, pull yourself together. We all deal with this sort of thing. I will make the argument throughout here that depression is as real of a biological disorder as is juvenile diabetes. And you don't sit down a diabetic and say, oh, come on, what's with this insulin stuff? Stop babying yourself and pull it together. You will see this is just as much of a biological disorder. Part of what makes that clear are a bunch of symptoms called vegetative symptoms. The bodies of major depressives work differently. First set of symptoms. No surprise, lots of people have trouble sleeping when they're having everyday off-the-rack depression. There's a certain pattern with people with major depression. What would you think? You're depressed, you have trouble falling asleep, toss and turn. That's not what you see with a major depressive. Instead, you wake up early. You wake up 4 in the morning, 5 in the morning, you're exhausted, but you're not going to sleep. Early morning wakening. You wind up in an emergency room somewhere, deeply depressed, and the clinician there better ask you at some point, how's your sleep been? Do you tend to wake up early in the day? Early morning wakening, classic sign. Additional thing, you do while sleeping, sleep is not this monolithic process. There's all these different stages of sleep, slow wave sleep, deep sleep, REM sleep, all of that. There's a structure and architecture to how we sleep, sort of 90-minute cycles as you go through the different phases. You look at the brain of somebody with depression while they're sleeping, and these different phases are completely disordered. The whole structure of sleep goes down the tubes. Look at somebody when they're sound asleep and their brain sleeps differently. This is not, oh, come on, stop babying yourself. This screams biology. More versions of it. Most of us, what we do when we're feeling kind of down is we eat more, out of this general belief that when you feel unloved, carbohydrates make you feel better. And bizarrely, there's actually a brain chemistry of it, of carbohydrates decrease stress hormone release. So for most of us, you're feeling bummed out about things, you eat more. That's not what you see in major depression, decreased appetite. Another thing you see is activation of the stress response. A class of stress hormones are highly elevated in people with major depression. You also have overactivation of something that's called the sympathetic nervous system, adrenaline. Overactivity of these components of the stress response, and that's really important. Because you look at someone with a major depression who's just mired in this psychomotor retardation stuff, and there's this temptation to start thinking about them as some sort of like sea sponge, some invertebrate thing where you're just so wiped out, you can't even get out of bed. It is just debilitating in that sense. That's not what's going on during depression. What you have instead is somebody whose body is blasting through their overactivated stress response, this enormous battle, all of it going on internally. And the fact that you see changes like these tell you this is not, oh, just so wiped out you can't even activate. This is someone whose body is having a massive stress response 24/7. There's a huge battle going on, and it's all internally, increased metabolic rate, increased muscle tone, all of this again screaming biology. The final thing that says tons of biology is lots of people with major depression have rhythmic patterns to the depression. You will get somebody where they will fall into a depression, where it will have 2 months of extreme severe symptoms, debilitating, come out the other end, and a year and a half later, the exact same pattern, a year and a half later, exact same thing. You have some people who only get their depressions during the winter, something known as seasonal affective disorders, SADS, and this is someone where something horrible happens to them in June, and they feel sort of sad for a couple of weeks, and they come out the other end, and nothing happens in January, and they fall into a depression, and they're hospitalized for a month and a half, just like every January for the last 10 years. And you see that, and that is all about biological clocks that are out of whack there. It's biology. This is not, oh, come on, pull it together. Okay, so hopefully what that begins to introduce is the notion, amid all these debilitating symptoms, these are ones that are about biology. These are bodies working differently. So starting to focus in more on the biology of it. What's going on in the brain in major depression? What I'll start off with is the chemistry of it. Okay, what we got here, do not panic if you are not familiar with this and have not wanted to think about science since high school sort of thing. You got two brain cells, you got two neurons. The way they talk to each other, they don't actually touch each other. In order for one neuron to send a message to another one, it needs to release a chemical messenger that goes floating over here and does something or other to this neuron. Chemical messenger called a neurotransmitter. And here we have a case of this, and by law, all neurons go from left to right. So this is a cell that continues down this way. It's all excited. It's trying to pass on some news to this neuron. There's a space in between called the synapse. And what this one is doing, because it's all excited, it has these little water balloons filled with neurotransmitters. Excitation signal comes along, dumps the neurotransmitters, they go floating across the synapse, bind to a receptor there, and then suddenly something changes in this neuron. That's how neurons talk to each other. How many different types of neurotransmitters there are? Probably hundreds. And what will be pertinent here is, in depression, there's just a handful of them that seem to be implicated. First neurotransmitter, something called norepinephrine. Norepinephrine first got implicated in depression in the early 50s, in the early 60s rather. What was the evidence? Around that time, the first generation of antidepressant drugs had been developed, something called MAO inhibitors. What do they do? Okay, so you got your neurotransmitters released, this neuron's excited. What do you have to do? It comes out, it does its thing with receptors, and then you have to clean up after yourself. You've dumped all this stuff in the synapse. What do you do then? You got two options. You can take the neurotransmitter and you can be green in your orientation. You can recycle it. You can take it back up in here and stick it back into one of these. You can do this recycling business. Or you could be terrible and carbon footprint. You can throw out your neurotransmitter. There's like enzymes sitting around here that break it up and flush it down the toilet. What's the toilet? Out into your cerebral spinal fluid, your bloodstream, your urine, whatever. So either recycling or degrade this stuff. So what do these MAO inhibitors do? They inhibit the activity of this enzyme that breaks down norepinephrine. Okay, so what's the logic there? So you inhibit the activity of this enzyme. You don't break down norepinephrine, so it's just floating around there, and for lack of anything else to do, it hits the receptor a second time, a third time, and a gazillionth time. And suddenly, somebody's depression goes away. What's your theory have to be at that point? Ooh, I bet there wasn't enough norepinephrine coming out. You find a means to increase the signaling, somebody gets better, and you now hypothesize there's a problem with too little norepinephrine. By the late 60s, another class of antidepressants came in called tricyclic antidepressants. What do? Essentially the same exact thing. What they do is they gum up this pump that recycles the stuff. Norepinephrine doesn't get removed from the synapse, has nothing else to do, hits the receptor second, third, 10th time, person feels better. Ooh, I think the problem in my theory is too little norepinephrine coming out. Thus, the norepinephrine hypothesis. More evidence for it, there are classes of drugs that will decrease your norepinephrine release. Why would you want to do that? In some parts of the body, excess of norepinephrine has something to do with high blood pressure. So you take a class of drugs, something called reserpine, and what it does is it disintegrates these things. And thus, you don't dump as much norepinephrine. Major side effect in lowering somebody's blood pressure that way is they fall into a depression. So you take a depressed person, you find a way of boosting up their norepinephrine signaling, they feel better. You take a normal person, you drive down their norepinephrine signaling, they get depressed. There's got to be a problem here with too little norepinephrine. So that's incredibly convincing. So at this point, what you got to say is, okay, great, that's convincing, that's irrefutable. What does norepinephrine do? People figured it out in the 50s, and it's got something to do with this. Take a rat and take a certain part of the brain, you put an electrode down in there where you can stimulate the neurons, you can force them to talk to each other when otherwise they have nothing to say, stimulate this pathway, and what you do is you make the rat unbelievably happy.
Where's their base at?
Okay, so of course the question is, how do you tell when a rat's unbelievably happy? And what you do is you make it work in order to get stimulated there. It presses a lever, and it presses a lever 25 times, and it gets a little buzz there, and it does another time, and rats will work themselves to death They get stimulated in this area. It is better than food. It is better than sex. If they're addicted to a drug and going through withdrawal, it is better than the drug. And what you see is this mediates pure pleasure. And this was
So
called the
what do we
pleasure
need so
pathway in the
far? Do we need more
1950s.
turns? What do we
So
need?
of course you look at it, and then what you have to then say is, ooh, do we have the same pathway?
Oh, that's
The new
good
one,
plan.
the second one. Shortly after that, people went looking and saw the exact same thing in humans. And this would be during neurosurgery, sort of classical neurosurgical techniques. You don't anesthetize the person. The brain doesn't feel pain. Once you've anesthetized the skin and the skull, you get through there, and you can actually keep somebody awake during surgery. And they used to need to do that, because you put your little needle down in one part of the brain, and the person flaps their arm, and another part, and they say the Pledge of Allegiance or whatever. And then you look at your little road map, and it says, okay, go
I wanna go
neurons
kill
and make
their
a left.
cases
People
now.
had to do that.
But we don't know where
So
their
it was
base is
around
at,
the
though,
early
huh?
60s that people started stimulating the same area in the human brain, and it is unbelievable what you got.
must be
There
in
were
the cave then,
transcripts
if we
of somebody,
can't find their
and you
base,
read it,
huh?
and the person is going on, you see stuff like, oh, that's great, that's kind of like sex, but you know when you have this itch and finally you get to scratch it, and you're like, oh, it's like getting back into bed, and you know, remember how
Yeah,
like
'cause
in
if
the
they're
fall,
sniping
you go
us,
out
yeah,
and play in the leaves,
they're
and
not
mom
too
would
far.
call you in and she made cookies, and then you get into your jammies with the feet on,
And
they
they're
just
close
go
by.
on. Where can you sign up and have this happen? The same exact sort of theme as in Iraq. And it was around that time that people discovered that in this pathway, it uses.
Then we can make fabricated snipers if you want, just go start
So if
shooting their
you've got a
shit.
shortage of norepinephrine in that part of the brain, what have you
Yeah,
just
again,
explained? That's the loss of pleasure. Great, utterly convincing. Here's all the
Oh yeah,
reasons why
long
you
neck.
shouldn't be
I heard the
convinced.
long neck
Problems
can do
began
damage.
to
Oh,
emerge.
bro, I had one, and the
First
fabricated
problem was,
sniper does more
there's
damage.
something weird with the
That's
time
what you
course.
need
You
to
throw in
work
any of the
out.
drugs I just talked
Fabricated
about, and norepinephrine signaling is changing
I
within like
see.
an hour.
For
You
long
put a
necks,
depressed person on those drugs, and they don't get better for a couple of
Yeah.
months.
Maybe
Something isn't
Compound
working
balls
there.
is
So
pretty
that was
good too, but we
mysterious.
need good ones though.
Next problem was, it turned out norepinephrine is
Yeah.
useful in this
You
pathway.
can get stuck
Another
different drops.
neurotransmitter
That's
turned
the
out
good
to
thing
be
about
even
the
more
compound
important,
gloves.
neurotransmitter called dopamine. Dopamine cocaine works on dopamine systems, so suddenly norepinephrine is just a minor
I
player in
was like,
this
wonder where the
pleasure pathway
Theomia
stuff.
was. Was
But
there
the biggest
Theomia?
problem came in the late 80s with the introduction of Prozac. Prozac,
Oh damn!
which
You
is
guys
an
put a bunch of
SSRI, a
Theomias with
selective
battles on it.
serotonin reuptake inhibitor. What that does is work on a completely different neurotransmitter system, this neurotransmitter called serotonin. What that drug does is it does the same deal, it stops the reuptake, increased serotonin signaling, and then what's your hypothesis? Ooh, you give somebody a Prozac SSRI, they feel better. I bet you there was too little serotonin. So it was during this period where there was just endless tragic, drive-by shootings of norepinephrine people by the serotonin crowd and the other way around.
What are you working on
Huge
right now, Chica?
controversy. And of course, like the middle of the road liberals, and why can't they all get along, would start sort of suggesting that, oh, maybe it's got something to do with norepinephrine and serotonin and dopamine and everybody hold hands and that's absolutely what's going on. The best evidence at this point, to be insanely
it's true.
simplistic, is that dopamine has something to
if
do
you
with
haven't
the
already
anhedonia. The absence of dopamine. The absence of norepinephrine has something to do with the
Oh, I
psychomotor
haven't done that yet.
retardation.
I've
The absence of serotonin
No,
is
I
this
haven't done any of them. I've
obsessive
gone to the
sense of
water.
grief. And interestingly, supporting that notion is
Yeah,
you can have an
I'll go get 'em right
obsessive
now.
sense of something else. You can have an
Trying to get
obsessive
this
need to
shit
keep your
done.
utensils perfectly symmetrical and obsessively wash your hands 8 hours a day.
gotta fill up the
Obsessive
plants because
compulsive
they're running
disorder,
low on plants.
that's helped by SSRIs like Prozac as well. Whatever it is you are just perseverating
alright.
over like
I'll be
mad,
on.
increasing serotonin signaling can help. So you've got at least 3 different neurotransmitters relevant to the pleasure, the psychomotor retardation, all of this, all
I'll
sorts
be
of
on
other
because
leads
it's
floating around.
12 o'clock over here already.
There's a
I
neurotransmitter
just turned
called
12.
substance P, and what substance P is about is pain.
Gotta
like
feed these
poke your
plants,
finger
these
and your
plants are
spinal
no
cord,
good.
there's neurons there are releasing substance, be talking to each other. It's about pain. It's about chronic pain syndromes. It's about whole body burns. Everybody knew this. And then it was discovered that if you get a drug that decreases substance P signaling, sometimes depressives get better. What does that suggest? It is not just a metaphor of depression as psychic pain. Your body is using the same brain chemistry to feel this sort of psychic pain of depression as just telling you, ooh, I just stubbed my toe. Interesting similarities there. Okay, so we got something about the neurochemistry. How about the neuroanatomy, the structure of the brain? And what you've got here is, this is the human brain. This is exactly what it looks like. It comes in 3 colors. And this was this formulation that came out during the 40s called the triune brain concept, which winds up being really, really inspiring. Down here at the bottom, you got the really boring nuts and bolts part of the brain. And this term, this is the reptilian part of the brain. Take a lizard, and it's basically the exact same stuff down here. What does this part of the brain do? Like regulatory, boring things. It measures your blood glucose levels, or if your blood pressure is dropped, it sends out a signal to tighten up your blood vessels. Just total boring plumbing type issues. Sitting on top of it is a much more interesting brain region called the limbic system. Limbic system is about emotion. You don't see a big limbic system until you get to mammals. Lizards are not famous for their emotional lives. The limbic system is much more about emotive stuff. Fear and lust and anger and rage and annoyance and God knows what. What you've got there are all sorts of ways where the limbic system talks to this part of the brain. And what it does is, rather than you being hemorrhaged, ooh, part this brain area, your body getting cold, whatever, you're some, elk, and there's some scary other elk there that's got you all upset, and you start secreting stress hormones. That's your limbic system saying, ooh, I don't like the smell of that guy talking down there. All sorts of means by which your emotional part of the brain can talk to stuff down here. Then you got the really interesting area. Up on top, the cortex. Cortex, all sorts of creatures out there have cortexes. We got more than anybody. It is this hugely expanded area. In primates, we proportionally have the biggest one out there. What does cortex do? It makes you do your taxes, and it does like processing visual information and tells you, aha, that's, punk rock, and that's not Beethoven, and all sorts of sensory stuff.
So they only tap your little base, so
There's
that's
an
over there.
interesting part of the cortex that's very relevant to all of us. Okay, suppose you finish the lecture, you go outside, unexpectedly you are gored by an elephant. What are you going to do? You are going to activate your stress response. You may feel a sense of grief at that point.
But
You
they're
may
probably
kind of
watching
hunker
us.
down at that point, a little psychomotor retardation. Appetite, there goes the dinner arrangements. Sex may not be the most appealing thing under that context. You are having a stress response in response to the sort of insult that this part of the brain is thinking about. So what's a depression? You sit there and you think about kids in refugee camps.
Do you have all
You
these
think
things
about
set on
the inevitable
aggressive?
mortality of your loved ones. You think about whatever, and suddenly your body does the exact same thing as if you were going by
No,
an
these are
elephant.
aggressive. They're
And what's
attacking
going on
everything.
there is you get the feelings, the abstract sort of depressive stuff there, and this part of the brain is able to make the rest of the brain go along with it as if this was an elephant goring you. On a certain totally simplistic level, what depression is about is the cortex whispering in the ear of the rest of the brain, saying this is as real as you were just physically assaulted by some sort of predator, whatever, and you turn on the exact same thing. On a very simplistic level, what the depression is
Damn, I'm
the
running out of
cortex
water
having
so
too
fast
many
right now.
sad
Jesus
thoughts
Christ.
and getting the rest of the brain to go
Oh, I
along.
seen an RG right now. It's heading
Okay,
towards
so
the beach
that's how you
area.
think about depression,
Or
which
unless
is
that's you,
insanely
Chica.
simplistic. You come up with an insanely simplistic treatment for depression, which is get yourself a pair of scissors and just and separate that part of the brain from the rest of it, and you're home free. That's
The beach area towards our anglerfish.
Well, that's certainly an advance in medicine. That is a medical procedure. It is called a cingulotomy. The part of the cortex called the anterior cingulate, a cingulotomy or a cingulum bundle cut. And what you do is you sever this pathway, and people get less depressed at that point. Okay, when does this happen? This is someone where every type of medication and every type of therapy and electroshock interventions, all of that has been tried, and every combination, and they're still on the back ward of the state hospital slashing their wrists every 3 months. That's when people try this. And the amazing thing of this desperate measure is people get less depressed at this point. Okay, so at that point you may want to look at that and say, well, anything else about these people when you've gone through there and just snipped away? Mind you, this is not a frontal lobotomy. Frontal lobotomy is doing something very undefined up there, but instead you're disconnecting here. What else is up with somebody when you've just disconnected part of their cortex from the rest of the brain? Ooh, insofar as the cortex can come up with abstractly sad thoughts and get the rest of the brain to go along with it, maybe the cortex also comes up with abstractly pleasurable thoughts and gets the rest of the brain. Have you just wiped out somebody's ability to have abstract pleasure? Absolutely. So suddenly you are off and running with a great philosophy term paper. Ooh, it's important that we have pain in order to have pleasure and all. This is nonsense. You get someone who's a candidate for this procedure back in the state hospital there where the wrists start over, and this is not somebody feeling a whole lot of abstract pleasure anyway. So what does this tell us? You come up with some ridiculously simplistic explanation that, ooh, you make it impossible for this sad part of the brain to whisper sad thoughts to the rest of the brain. The best people in the field thinking about this can't come up with anything a lot more sophisticated than that. So that tells us something about the brain structure with depression. Final bit of biology here, hormones. What do hormones have to do with it? One very important domain of hormones. You take somebody and they're having problems with a class of hormones, thyroid hormones. What thyroid hormones are about is maintaining your metabolism, keeping your body warm enough, all that sort of stuff. If you have a severe shortage of thyroid hormone, lots of things happen, including you fall into a major depression. Hypothyroidism is associated with major depression. There's an autoimmune disease called Hashimoto's disease, which involves problems with secreting thyroid hormone, and that's a basic feature of it. And somebody comes in, and you diagnose it, and you give them normal levels of thyroid hormone, and away goes their depression. Lots of lessons with that. First one is, best estimates are that 20% of major depressions are undiagnosed hypothyroid syndromes instead. The next one it demonstrates is, you better, when somebody is thinking about your psychiatric state, you better have somebody there who's thinking about your nutrition, your hormone levels, your nothing about what's going on here is independent of the rest of the body. So a big role for thyroid hormones. Next domain of hormones being relevant. You take women. You take women and they have a higher incidence of major depression than men do, approximately twice the rate. In addition, women have their highest vulnerability to depression at certain points in their reproductive life histories. After you've given birth, a post-parturition depression, around the time of your period, around the time of menopause, all of these scream biology. So you look at why women have elevated rates of depression, and there's biology, there's all sorts of other schools of thought that have gone into it. There are ones having more kind of sociological framework. Lack of control can cause depression in society after society. Women traditionally have less control. No wonder they fall into more depression. There's another school that focuses on a certain style of emotional differences you see between the genders. On the average, women tend to ruminate more on emotionally upsetting things, to focus in on them more. And this sounds totally stereotypical, and when you do the studies, there's overlaps between individuals, but nonetheless, on the average, what you see is these sorts of studies where you get someone after they've just had a fight with a close friend, and what do women do when they give a choice of a whole bunch of activities? They choose to fill out questionnaires about how they met their friend, and what the age of their relationship is, and does the friend have a good marriage, and all of that. You do it to guys, and they fill out questionnaires about, like, trivia questions about the Civil War. Oh my God, they can't express their emotions, no wonder they're impossible. And of course, again, individual variation, this is highly stereotyping. On the average though, women ruminate more on upsetting emotions than men do. So that is solid science. What is completely unsolid science is the speculation at that point that if you ruminate on bad feelings, you're more prone to a depression. So that's a whole emotional regulation argument. But you come back to that business of women are most at risk for a depression in the 2 weeks after giving birth, around the period of their periods, menopause, and that's all about hormones. And by now, there's a huge literature having to do with the effects on all that stuff over there of estrogen and progesterone, and probably most importantly, the ratio of estrogen to progesterone and what's going on around giving birth, one's period. Levels of this stuff is just shooting around all over the place, and the sense is something goes out of whack with the ratios there, and everything about estrogen, progesterone, and the ratio can change the number of receptors for these neurotransmitters, the extent to which you do this reuptake pump. Whatever depression is going to turn out to be on this nuts and bolts level, estrogen and progesterone can do something to it. Final class of hormones that are relevant. A class of hormones released during stress. Okay, what's the most famous stress hormone on earth? Adrenaline. Adrenaline is this vastly underrated hormone that I despise because there's a much more important stress hormone out there to which I've devoted the last 30 years of my life. A class of stress hormones called glucocorticoids. They come out of your adrenal gland during stress. The human version is hydrocortisone, also known as cortisol. All sorts of other species out there, you secrete these glucocorticoids when you are stressed. You look at people with major depression, and about half of them have elevated levels of glucocorticoids through the roof. There is something out of whack with the regulation of this stress hormone during depression. What's that about? That's back to people with depression are not invertebrates sitting there in their beds. These are bodies undergoing massive stress responses. There's a huge emotional battle going on, all of it inside their heads. So elevated stress hormone levels. What's very clear is you get exposed to a lot of glucocorticoids, and you're more at risk now for depression. You can see this epidemiologically. You get people, and statistically, before their first major depressive episode, something awful, stressful occurs. And that's where this happens, and this is the subset of people who stay down there far longer. Have one of those first depressive episodes due to some stressful event, you come out the other side eventually, you are no more at risk for depression than anybody else. Along comes a second major stressor, and you fall into a depression, come out the other end, no more at risk for than anyone else with depression. Somewhere around the fourth or fifth stress-induced depression, something happens and things start cycling on their own there, and you no longer need a major stressor to cause you to get depressed like that. That's when the clocks are off and running. That's the transition. Okay, so major stress can predispose you towards depression. More evidence, there's a disease called Cushing's disease, where people secrete boatloads of this glucocorticoid stuff. People with Cushing's fall into depressions. There's a whole bunch of diseases where people have to be treated with lots of glucocorticoids. They fall into depression. What are glucocorticoids doing? A whole lot of them, and your brain gets depleted of dopamine. And you're right back in this domain. That's probably the neurochemistry how you get it. Okay, so what do we got at this one? We got something about brain chemistry and depression. We got something about the structure of the brain. We got something about hormones. You are a card-carrying biological psychiatrist, and that's all you need to know about the subject. And if that's all you know about the subject, you are going to be pitifully bad at making anybody get better. Because all of this knowledge winds up being effective for treating maybe 30–40% of depressives. The vast majority of people, the antidepressant drugs don't do a whole lot there. All you got there is modern cutting-edge biology stuff, and that's not enough. So what I'll transition to here is now talking about the psychology of depression, because you better have that piece of the story, or else you're absolutely useless. Starting off with, I make apologies here, but I actually have to say the name of Sigmund Freud, because he winds up being very relevant to depression. Freud, back when, dealt with this puzzle of the difference between we all get depressed and come out the other end, and the subset of people who crash. The turn of the century Viennese term for people who come out the other side, mourning. Something you recover. turn of the century Viennese term for major depression, melancholia. And Freud in this famous essay said, why is it that a subset of us fall into it? And what's the difference between mourning and melancholia? And he came up with a really interesting line. Okay, according to Freud, you have mixed feelings and ambivalencies about everybody you love out there. You love them and you hate them and you resent them and you yearn for them and you reject them and all that Freudian stuff. So in this Freudian view, you have lost a loved one. That can also be a loved concept, a loved goal, a loved thing. You have lost a loved one. What happens then is, in most people, you are able to focus on the love and the sense of loss. You mourn, and you come out the other end. In Freud's view, what melancholia is about is the subset of people who can't put the negative feelings in the background, and instead you are awash in the love and the hate and the regret and the pain and the delight and all of that. And what a depression is this wallowing, this melancholic loss in the ambivalencies you have about the lost loved one. It explains tons. No wonder you have the grief. Lose somebody and go through the mourning business, and only one thing is wrong: you've lost this loved one. Lose somebody with melancholia, and two things have happened. You've lost the loved one, and you have now lost the opportunity to ever make things better with them. No wonder you have the guilt. You're sitting there saying, thank God, I'm finally done with this person. They are never going to control my life. How can I think such a thing like that? Sudden crippling guilt, all sorts of other symptoms. And out of this came this wonderful soundbite: depression is aggression turned inward. Because you've got nobody else out there to have these arguments with. This is the person who you have most loved but most hated, and you've never said the things you needed to hear, and pounding at the door to get them to finally be able to tell them, and now you've lost that opportunity forever, and all you can do is internalize all of that aggression turned inward. No wonder you're not feeling a whole lot of pleasure. No wonder you're secreting stress hormones. No wonder you're not getting out of bed all that readily with the psychomotor retardation stuff. This really powerful soundbite of aggression turned inward. That's great. What isn't great is how in hell do you turn like Freudian ambivalent feelings into something about neurochemistry, or like what do estrogen progesterone ratios have to do with like love-hate ratios? It's great, it feels very intuitive. You can't do modern science on it, which is the problem with the best parts of Freud. Okay, so instead you need to shift over to looking at experimental psychology and understanding what is the psychology of stress. What is it that makes psychological stressors stressful? And an enormous literature now shows that for the same external misery, you feel more stressed, you turn on a stress response, you're more at risk for stress-related disease if you don't have outlets for the frustration caused by the stressor, if you feel like you have no control over what's happening, you have no predictability as to when it's occurring, and you don't have anybody's shoulder to cry on. This is what psychological stress is about. And what a depression is pathological extremes of this. You fall into the cognitive psychology soundbite of what a depression is. It's learned helplessness. It is learning to be helpless. Something bad happens to you, a rat, getting some shocks now and then, you, a human experiencing some loss, and the logical thing you should do is learn, this is awful. When I'm in this situation, there's not a damn thing I can do about it. It's awful, I feel terrible, but this is not the whole world. And what a major depression is about is you sit there and you're that rat, and in this setting, you get uncontrollable shocks, but put you in another setting, and just by hitting a lever a couple of times, you avoid the shocks. You don't bother doing it because you've learned to be helpless. Just like a human depression. What learned helplessness is taking a circumstance where by any logic, again, you should be saying, this is awful, but it is not the whole world, and do this cognitive distortion and decide this is indeed the entire world. And I have no control, I am always helpless, I am always hopeless. This is the psychology of what a depression is about. At that point, you don't have a whole lot of trouble seeing how you wind up in here, stress, effects on some dopamine, all that sort of stuff. Okay, so we've got two extremely different viewpoints here as to what depression is about. Modern biological stuff, and this totally different world of psychology, loss, lack of control. One version of it, one of the most reliable findings in the
My
whole
bad.
epidemiology of depression is lose a parent to death
Were you saying anything to
when
me,
you were
Chica?
under 10 years of age, and for the rest of your life you were at risk for major depression. This makes perfect sense. What is a lot of what's going on during your first 10 years of life? You were learning about cause and effect. You were learning about is this a world out there where I have any sort of efficacy, where I have any sort of control? And you have just learned in the most big time awful way, there are things you can't control and sometimes they are awful. And what have you just learned? There's all sorts of reasons where one can be helpless. And you're that much closer to this edge of this learned helplessness cliff for the rest of your life. Extremely powerful model here of that. So you got all the biology stuff. You've got this weird Freudian aggression turned inward, which just feels right, but you can't do modern science on it. You got this whole world. How do you begin to put this world and that world together? And the critical link turns out to be stress. Stress is the intersection of the two in a very interesting domain. Okay, depression is a genetic disorder. What do I mean by that? Depression has some degree of heritability. Depression tends to run in families. Depression runs more reliably as you look at closer and closer relatives, and you eventually look at identical twins, and if one of them has depression, the other has a 50% chance. Full siblings who are not identical twins, 25% chance, half sibling, about 8%, person off the street, about a 2%, 50% chance when they share the identical genes. What does that do? That tells you this is a disorder that has a genetic component. What does that also tell you? If you've got 50% likelihood, if you've got all the genes in common, and you've got a 50% chance of not getting the depression, it tells you genes are important, but they're not more important than any other component. So genes and depression are not about inevitability, they're about vulnerability. So what is the vulnerability about? A few years ago, people discovered a particular gene that's really relevant to whether or not you get depression. What was exciting about that? It was a very clear finding. It has since been replicated. What else was exciting about it? It made sense. This was not some weirdo gene having something to do with how your big toe functions. This was a gene having something to do with serotonin. And this was a gene relevant to this whole reuptake, pumping business, all of that. The main point of it is this gene comes in two different flavors. Each one of us has one of the two versions. And you immediately get this prediction, one of the versions, by all logic, should be predisposing to depression. One of them is the one that should get you in more trouble. So what does it look like when you go and study it? First paper that reported this a few years ago, and this I suspect is going to wind up being viewed as the most important paper in biological psychiatry for a quarter of a century. This was this massive study where a bunch of researchers looked at 17,000 kids growing up in New Zealand, following them year after year and looking at the genetic makeup of these individuals, and then asking in their early 20s, who's got problems with major depression? And then asking this critical question, what does it have to do with this gene? Does the version of that gene that gets you into trouble, by all logic, is that going to set you up for more of a depression? Are you more at risk for depression if you've got the bad version of the gene? And that comes the finding, which is no, it doesn't increase your risk. You look here, and what's your likelihood of depression? And you got the good version, and it's likely, and you got the bad version, and it's this likely. Doesn't make a difference unless something else is going on, unless you have a history of exposure to major stressors. And what you were able to do is quantify how many major stressors somebody has had during their childhood, their development, and that involves parental divorce and physical abuse and death of family member, all that sort of thing. And what you see is in the folks who have the good version of the gene, as you have more and more of a history of major stressors, your risk of depression goes up, absolutely. Now you look at the people with the bad version of the gene, and as you have more and more of a history of stress, your risk of depression does this. And when you look at the major history of stressors, a 30-fold difference in the likelihood. This is not about, oh, genes control our brains and genes control our behavior. This is a gene that is relevant to how readily we pick ourselves up after life has dumped us on our rear ends, how readily we recover from stressors. What's the final piece of that story? Glucocorticoids regulate the function of this gene. All the pieces fall into place there. Wonderfully logical, and suddenly you have a way of taking this whole world of psychological components of stress and tying it into all that biochemistry. Wonderfully integrated model. Okay, so in lots of ways, this is where the field is at this point. And what should mostly have come through here amid all this minutia and factoids and all of that is the role of stress and the intersection of biology and the psychological stuff in childhood as a very important time to imprint how vulnerable you are to depression for the rest of your life. But again, the single thing I want to emphasize over and over, implicit in everything on that left side of the board there, which is this is not, oh, pull yourself together, we all get depressed. This is as real of a biological disorder as is diabetes. And that's the thing I most want you guys to take off from here. And in the context of a university setting is rife with major depression. The community of high-achieving type A individuals is rife with major depression. It is all around us, and amid it being all around us, there is this weird corrosive inhibition, embarrassment, discomfort we have with the world of psychiatric diseases. One of the greatest things, if you're a researcher with disease, one of the things you pray for is for some powerful senator to have their loved one come down with your disease, because they're going to set up a foundation, funding, and advocacy groups and all of that, and not for psychiatric
Is there
disorder.
any
Bases
inside the swamp, or is it free?
And amid this screaming biology, and this is a devastating disease, and all of that, in any place, and especially
Because I'm in a swamp looking
like
for a
this,
long
where
fucking
everyone is
cemented
supposed to be
base.
golden and functioning and flawless and just gliding through life, this is one of the hardest diseases for people to admit to. So it is there, it's all over the place, and it's biology, and you should be no more inhibited about admitting that you've got something going on that's funny with this type of gene than you would be to admit that your pancreas isn't secreting insulin. So let me stop at this point, and again, unfortunately, I got to sprint out the door, otherwise I'm going to take questions, but thanks.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.
Ooh, that's a cap roll, not good. And snakes.
Stanford University.
A variety of announcements. Tomorrow, office hours are shifted because at 4:30 there's a really interesting lecture over at Clark. This guy is one of the experts on the whole notion that there are brain metabolic abnormalities in sociopathic humans, violent criminals. He's got the distinction of having the world's only portable MRI. He has a big old Winnebago with an MRI machine, and he drives all around the country from one maximum security prison to another, trying to look at aspects of frontal cortical dysfunction in extremely violent individuals. I have no idea if he's a good lecturer or not. The material is going to be really interesting. So that's something that probably should be caught. Friday, again, is not going to be videotape, but just audio tape for a number of reasons. Finally, over next year, I will be doing, if anyone is interested, some directed readings with people that will be essentially more of an exploration of some of the topics in the course here. So if you are interested, do not send me anything whatsoever until it's the summer. At that point, CV, transcript, anything I need to know, but it'll be posted on the courseworks as to more details about it. Okay, so we pick up with the home stretch here of language. And what we got to, just on the edge of 2 days ago, is to now begin to look at the genetics of language use. In general, there's the usual types of techniques from behavior genetics. The first is looking for covariance of certain language abnormalities in certain families. And the evidence for that is clear with Williams syndrome, with the selective language impairment. Those tend to run in families, and they tend to show classical Mendelian inheritance, very readily thought of as genetically influenced disorders. Then going to our usual deal of looking at adopted individuals, twins, identical twins separated at birth, that whole armamentarium of behavioral genetic stuff. What does that show? There's a fair degree of heritability of things like vocabulary complexity, ability to spell, skill at phonology, things of that sort. In general, the evidence is pretty poor for a strong genetic load on dyslexias, on learning disorders of that type. Of course, the modern version of it all is to start looking at the actual genes, the molecular biology of language disorders, of language in general. First thing that comes up is this gene that has been at the center of the whole field for years now, a gene called FOXP2. And it was originally identified as having a mutation in a family that had a very specific linguistic problem running through it, language generation, speech. This family had severe problems with it, classic looking for a genetic marker, and eventually narrowing down to a gene itself, turning out to be this mysterious gene, FOXP2, which turned out to be a transcription factor and a mutation in it in this family. What immediately became clear is this theme over and over again with language, insofar as there's a problem in this family. Is it at the cognitive level of what language is about symbolically, or is it just getting your lips and tongues and articulating and that much more mechanical level? It initially looked like it was much more the latter in this family. It is apparently more of a mixture of both, just to make things really confusing. What you see is it is preferentially expressed in that part of the brain we heard about the other day, the basal ganglia. That area that's playing a role in gesturing when you're speaking, playing a role in facial prosody, that sort of stuff, motoric stuff. And the fact that it was found so heavily expressed in there, it was part of what got people to think what's fundamentally wrong with this family is motor aspects of language production. Again, it's gotten messier since then, because these folks have a variety of cognitive impairments in the realm of language. So of course, immediately what we need to be asking is, what's FOXP2 doing in other species? Does it occur in other species? And it turns out that it is all over the place. You find FOXP2 in birds and mammals and all sorts of things, large and small. It is very, very widespread. But, importantly, a different version than you find in humans. It is immensely conserved, which is to say you see the same version of FOXP2 ranging from apes to birds, everything in between. Nothing has changed with that evolutionarily in a long, long time. So what does it do? Handful of studies in animals where the gene has been knocked out, it has been removed, where you now have mice that do not have the gene, and what you see is there's less vocalization and simpler vocalization. And that's back to our whole world of the sonic vocalizations that you can't hear when mice are giggling and that sort of thing. Knock out this gene and there's less vocalizing and there's less complexity to it. So it's doing something or other that looks plausible, and it's expressed in motoric parts of the brain, preferentially in these other species. So the super conserved version of this gene, everybody else has the same version, and then you look at the human version, and
Who are the speed hackers
there's a
again?
bunch of differences, and they emerged very recently. Best estimates are the last couple of 100,000 years. Each one of the changes extremely positively selected for. Whatever this gene is about, once it sort of went on the human path, it changed real fast under major selective and advantageous conditions, and thus we've got a real different version from everyone else. Next interesting thing about it, insofar as it is a transcription factor, when you look at the genes that it regulates, so this is now taking our one step further, our old genetic network deal, when you look downstream what genes it regulates, they tend to be fairly differentiated from other primates and to have differentiated as a result of positive selection. So this is a whole cluster of genes that evolution was doing some pretty stringent things on in hominids in the last couple of 100,000 years. Now, what you do is one of the all-time cool studies, which was last year, which you take mice and you knock out their FOXP2 gene, and now you stick in the human version. And amazingly, what happens is, once these animals mature, they speak just like Mickey Mouse. Okay, people were listening. What you wind up seeing is, it's probably the Disney people probably are working on it, and that's going to be the end of life as we know it when they let those ones loose. What you get when you express the human FOXP2 in a mouse is a mouse with more vocalizations and more complex ones. Whoa, that is mighty interesting area of lots and lots of work these days trying to figure out what this transcription factor is about, but clearly just this screaming imprint of major league selection that has gone on for the human version and for the genes that it regulates. Fairly recently, it is no surprise that this gene is central to such a different, unique thing that we're doing. More evidence for genetic components to language. And this one is a very indirect one, but this totally interesting phenomenon that has been shown in lots and lots of different places on the globe. So you get some circumstance where a whole bunch of people are brought together from different cultures with different language groups and wind up having to deal with each other. Classic version is you get, for example, slave populations brought from different places in West Africa to some of the Caribbean islands. You have on some of the Hawaiian islands, early in the last century, people from all over Asia brought over to work the plantations there, the fields, whatever. What you have in these cases is a whole bunch of people thrown together who have languages from every which way who don't understand each other. And what always emerges, what has been extremely well documented, is some sort of fragmentary communication system that is made up of bits and pieces of all the relevant languages, which everybody can kind of limp through and begin to be understood with each other. And what that is wound up being called is a pidgin language. Pidgin, very simplistic version that shows virtually nothing in the way of complex grammar, and it's basically a vehicle for getting individuals who almost always in these cases are societally pretty under the foot of powers that be to deal with each other, to work with each other, working out this proto-communication system with fragments of each language. Okay, that's not surprising. What is totally cool is what happens next over the next 1 to 2 generations, which is this pidgin thing, this committee glued together amalgamation of fragments of different languages within a generation or two has evolved into a real language, which is then known as a Creole language. Creole languages are languages that are a couple of generations descended from pidgin, and what you see is it winds up being a real language. That's fine. That's, fine, given that 2 days ago we're hearing that it was possible for kids to come up and invent Nicaraguan Sign Language within a generation. Okay, so you start with this pidgin thing, and within a couple of generations it turns into a real language, fits the rules, grammar, all of that. Here is the thing that is so interesting about this phenomenon, which is all of the creoles have the same grammatical structure. What is that about? Creoles from all over the planet that were built upon all sorts of differing hodgepodges of original languages in the Pidgin. Creole languages all have a similar grammatical structure. Easy explanation, easy boring one, which is it's very simple grammatical structures, and this is a language that's just getting off its feet in each case. No. In all these cases, it is grammatical structures that are not necessarily the simplest. It's not just some baby step languages. It's languages that all seem to come up with the same grammatical structures there. And what this has given rise to is the notion that there is a default grammar built into humans. Let humans go running with a whole bunch of fragments in different languages, and not surprisingly, we're able to turn it into a real communicative system within a generation or two. And when pulling language out of thin air, humans always tend to come up with the same sort of grammatical structures that are not necessarily the simplest. Argument there being there is an innate, there is a hardwired, there is an ancient default pattern of grammar that humans use when they come up with language. So totally interesting. What you find also with the sign languages as they get invented, Nicaraguan Sign Language, it went through a first generation of being Pidgin and soon turned into a signing equivalent of Creole, and it has some of the same grammatical structures. Even when humans are defaulting into a new language that's purely gestural, it shows some of these constraints that you see with the Creole languages. Other features of this that come through. Apparently, there's like 24 different ways that you could put together objects and subjects and rejects and participles and whatever it is.
Okay. Yeah.
Grammatical structures, this guy Joseph Greenberg, linguist, who was here at Stanford until a few years ago when he died, apparently an incredible titan in the field, he did some of this research. There's 24 possible different ways languages can do this object-subject business, and all across Earth, all across the 6,000 languages there, you only see 15 of them used. And the vast majority of grammars on Earth only use 4 of them. So the argument there winds up being, this is a pretty non-random skew. Again, we're seeing some kind of prepared learning default grammars, this very imprecise sense of there's something genetic floating around here. So that complementary to the whole world, instead of looking at things like FOXP2 and its mutations, the usual 2 very different approaches. That whole Pidgin to Creole transition is really, really interesting, and it really has this feel in the undercurrents of it that there is a basic human grammar that floats around there, a notion that Chomsky has pushed for a long, long time. Okay, jumping one box further back, ecological factors and language. And we'll touch on that only briefly, but what you've got is something similar to a theme we heard a couple of weeks ago, which is possibly not something we heard a couple of weeks ago, and we'll instead hear on Friday. But what you see is diverse ecosystems, very biodiverse ecosystems. Rainforest ones, for example, produce cultures which have a great deal of diversity in them. What we're going to see on Friday, the version of that, which I'm now thinking I did mention before, is that polytheistic cultures are the things you tend to see coming out of rainforest settings, that notion that if there's 100, if there's 1,000 different types of edible plants in your world, it doesn't take a great leap to decide there's a whole lot of different spirit things in the world going on there, polytheism. A very similar theme, great work done a few years ago, a guy named William Sutherland from the University of Dundee, I think, where what he showed was looking all over the planet, looking at the biodiversity in different regions on the planet. The more ecological diversity, the more linguistic diversity you would find in that region. The more different languages, which of course thus translates down into small groups, small numbers of speakers, this interesting phenomenon phenomenon, which it's not completely clear to me what to make of that, but ecosystems that are very diverse generate an abundance of theistic notions at above expected rates, and also produces a whole lot more languages, something in the diversity there. What his work then showed is about everything else I'm going to say in this area, which is just totally depressing stuff, which is linguistic diversity is going down the tubes faster than biodiversity. He shows that the rate of language extinction proportionately is faster than the rate of extinction of various species, plants, etc. in these rainforest ecosystems. Totally grim, depressing picture. What seems to be the case, given where things are heading, is in the next century, in this century, 90% of Earth's languages will go extinct. The vast majority of humans on this planet speak less than 10 different languages out of the 6,000 existing ones. How's this for depressing? There's a couple of hundred different languages that are Inuit and Northwest Native American and some other population as well. And currently, only 5% of those languages have speakers who are not elderly. That's real depressing also, and something that strikes me as extraordinary is in each one of those cases, somewhere along the way, there's going to be somebody in old age who's the last person on earth who understands their language. There's not a single other person alive who will be able to talk in their mother tongue with them. Languages disappearing left and right, along with, of course, cultural diversity going down the tubes, the process of turning the whole world into a lowest common denominator of McDonald's culture, blah, blah. Along with that comes a huge, huge loss of language diversity. Finally, jumping to our last box, if we're talking about ecological factors, thinking about things like genes, thinking about things like highly, highly driven positive selection for genes like FOXP2 in humans, of course, we have to talk about the evolutionary end of things. So, evolution of language in humans. General notion is click languages, which you tend to see in hunter-gatherers in Africa, that might have been the earliest forms, the most ancient types of languages on Earth. And what you also see is hunter-gatherers are probably the most ancient sort of populations of humans that live in Africa, with waves of agriculturalists coming from North Africa, the Middle East at later points, pastoralists coming from around there as well. The original populations in Africa were hunter-gatherers, and they have high frequencies of these click languages. That might be the starting point for human language. Interestingly, though, you also see click languages among a lot of Aboriginal groups in Australia. What does that tell you? Those came separately. There was a huge gulf of time between leaving Africa and the first populations winding up in Australia. Convergent evolution. For some reason, click languages is a very fundamental way that people come up with communication systems. So, selection issues, often running with our sociobiological notions of language advantages. It's easy to see what the advantages are of having a language system. It is easier to store, to archive knowledge, information. It is easier to coordinate hunts. It is easier to figure out what we did the last time there was a famine. Figuring out things like that, all of those facilitated by language. In the memorable words of Steve Pinker from Harvard, language is how we outsmart plants. Language allows us to do all sorts of organizational stuff. Language evolution is all about sequence. We don't say words simultaneously. It's all sequences, and a number of people have emphasized that's what the construction of tools are about also. A whole process of careful logical sequential transitions of steps, almost certainly tool use and language use as sequential processes emerging in parallel. Finally, obviously, you see all sorts of room for cooperation with kin selection, cooperation with reciprocal altruism being enhanced with communication, but very importantly for our game theory world, what language also allows you to do is lie. that whole business from 2 days ago. In human language, there's that arbitrariness. There's a dissociation between the message and the messenger. It's not like dogs that have to put the lid on their fear pheromones by tucking their tail. What you have is the capacity to lie. And of course, running off from that, a whole world of evolutionary strategizing. Pertinent to that, there's a huge disproportionate share of neurons in the motor system devoted to facial expressions and mouth coordination and all that kind of world. A really good thing, if you plan to lie, is to be able to have good control over your facial expressions. Finally, formal game theory models showing when you have pairs of individuals playing against each other, when you allow the emergence of communication between two of the players versus not in the other group, you immediately, no surprise, have them getting a big advantage. If you allow them semanticity, to have words that they can communicate, that is advantageous, that improves outcome. Even better is if you allow semanticity and structure, syntax, grammar, so that they can have more complex communication. All of those wind up being things that facilitate winning in game theory settings. Finally, interesting parallelism back to that biodiversity stuff, which is when you look at all those different possible grammatical structures, the 24 of them, 15 of which is the total of what appears on Earth, the rarest of the grammatical structures are the ones that are closest to extinction. The rarest, not in terms of the number of people speaking it within a population, but the structures that have occurred the fewest number of times in cultures across the planet are the ones that are in cultures where the languages are most readily to be lost, some sort of connection there. And thus you've got some sort of weird grammatical imperialism that has emerged over the years. Again, what strikes me as like a totally depressing number, 90% of Earth's languages will disappear in the next century. Okay, so now we jump to our next topic, which is our first psychiatric disease. And to remind you from 2 days ago, we're not going to have a depression lecture. The depression chapter in the Zebras book will tell all the same stuff in much better, more clear terms, I say, proving my point. And what you should do is read it with as much attention to it as if it has been a lecture subject. It is an important subject. Enough hints. Okay, so check that one out. What we focus on today, though, is schizophrenia. And we're going to take our same old strategy, starting off with what does the disease look like, and as you will see, all sorts of surprises in there, and then what goes on in the brain just before, early development, prenatal, genes, evolution, the whole deal there. We know this drill once again. So starting off, making sense of schizophrenia as a bunch of behaviors, you got to challenge right off the bat, which is lots of people use the word schizophrenic in an everyday sense that has no resemblance whatsoever to its actual technical use. Schizophrenic or schizzy, and we all know that one. We go, my God, I am having such a schizzy day. I overslept. I missed my first class. It was terrible. I totally screwed up. But then I found out I got this great grade on a midterm, but then I had this fight with a friend, but then in the afternoon, and then this crashed, and blah, blah. God, what a schizoid day I'm having. No resemblance to how the term's actually used. That's not any sort of real term in psychiatry, whatever the schizy days are that we all experience now and then. Schizophrenia is something else. On the most technical level, schizophrenia is a disease of people where when you start talking to them, within 2 or 3 sentences, you realize there's something strange with their thinking. They're not thinking normally. They're not communicating normally. On the most fundamental level, that's what the disease is. Okay, obviously far more precise than that. Schizophrenia, disease of thought disorder, disease of inappropriate emotion, disease of inappropriate attribution of things, and what you'll see is this is not just some sort of generic craziness in the way that that word means nothing whatsoever. There are typical structures to the ways in which things are not working right in the behavior of schizophrenics, which we'll hear about in a bit. Part of what begins to bring that across is the obvious fact that there's no way that schizophrenia is just one disease, because there's all sorts of subtypes. It is a bunch of heterogeneous diseases. You have a subtype paranoid schizophrenia, where what it's all about is thought disorder built around a sense of persecution. You have catatonic schizophrenia, where the person is in a frozen state, immobile for long periods of time. You have schizoaffective disorders, which is kind of a mixture of schizophrenia and depression disorders. It's not just one disease. So the whole sort of array of behavioral symptoms we're going to look at.
Oh shit. Oh no. I never seen one of those, to be honest. That's weird. Are you sure there's not a glitch going on? Or a bug? Alright. For sure, bro.